Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Ancient Epics, the place where the greatest stories of humanity come back to life. Long before cinema painted the undead in blood and thunder, before midnight streets echoed with imagined footsteps of the risen dead, there existed a quieter and far more unsettling truth. In scattered court records of the Caribbean, names appeared twice, once at burial, and once years later, walking the fields. In the soil of distant deserts, ancient inscriptions spoke of souls bound, bodies commanded, and minds sealed away by ritual law. Across 3,000 years of human memory, a single fear repeated itself with chilling consistency, that death was not always the final gate, and that a human being could be forced to cross back without consent. This was not a tale of monsters hunting the living, but of the living robbed of themselves. Hollowed by fiction, yet its roots lay buried in earth, law, poison, and belief. In Haiti, whispers followed the beat of drums and the rhythm of prayer, telling of bodies stolen after burial and returned as shadows of their former lives. Far across oceans and centuries, ancient civilizations recorded eerily similar anxieties, etched into stone and papyrus, describing the terror of a soul trapped between worlds, denied rest, denied memory. But from cultures deeply aware of death, astronomy, medicine, and the fragile boundary between life and oblivion. This is the forgotten lineage of the zombie, a lineage not born in fantasy, but carved from human history itself. Moonlit graveyards and salt-stung plantations, where the greatest horror was not dying. In the warm, wind-swept lands of Haiti, the earth itself carries memory. The island rests along tectonic fractures. Long before European ships arrived, the Tano people lived here. Guided by ancestral spirits known as Zemus, guardians of life, death, and renewal. When the transatlantic slave trade shattered West and Central African civilizations and scattered their people across the Atlantic, ancient spiritual systems survived the crossing. These traditions did not arrive as superstition, but as frameworks for understanding suffering, survival, and the unseen order of the universe. The human being was understood as composed of multiple spiritual elements, including the T-bone age, the seat of consciousness and will. To lose it was not death in the biological sense, but something more devastating, the erasure of personhood. The idea of a zombie, in its original Haitian meaning, was not a monster, but a warning. It symbolized the ultimate punishment, a body animated, yet spiritually silenced, condemned to labor without memory or self. Historical accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe enslaved communities where the fear of zombification exceeded the fear of death itself. Colonial laws, brutally enforced, mirrored this terror. To be reduced to an object was already a living nightmare. To remain so beyond death was the final horror. Within this context, the zombie was not entertainment, but moral law, a reminder of the sanctity of the soul and the consequences of violating it. Yet behind the spiritual framework lay a darker and more tangible reality. In the 20th century, ethnobotanists began to document substances used in ritual practices not as tools of faith alone, but as pharmacological agents. Chief among them was tetrodotoxin, a potent neurotoxin found in pufferfish native to Caribbean waters. In precise doses, it could slow the heart, paralyze the body, and induce a state nearly indistinguishable from death, while leaving consciousness faintly intact. Burial could follow. Oxygen deprivation could damage memory and cognition. Revival, if it occurred, would produce a human being profoundly altered. This knowledge did not diminish the spiritual meaning of zombification. Rather, it revealed how ancient cultures intertwined medicine, ritual, and cosmic order. Science did not erase the myth. It explained how the myth could exist. Far from Haiti, across deserts scorched by the same sun that governed the seasons, ancient Egypt wrestled with an almost identical terror. The Egyptians were masters of death. Their embalming techniques preserved flesh for millennia. Their funerary texts mapped the soul's perilous journey beyond the grave. Yet among their most feared concepts was not decay, but the failure of the soul to reunite correctly. The Egyptian soul was divided into components: the Ka, the life force; the Ba, the personality; and the Ak, the transformed spirit. Death required precise ritual balance. If disturbed, a person could become a restless being, neither alive nor properly dead. Funerary texts warned against improper burial, body theft, and magical coercion. Spells existed not only to protect the dead, but to control them, a chilling acknowledgement that animation without harmony was possible. In certain legal and magical papyri dating back over 3,000 years, references appear to servants fashioned for the afterlife, known as a shabdi. These figurines were believed to awaken when commanded, performing labor in place of the deceased. Though symbolic, they reflect a cultural acceptance of controlled animation, of bodies or representations moved by external will. The fear was not that the dead would rise unbidden, but that they could be compelled. Astronomical alignments reinforced these beliefs. Tombs were oriented toward circumpolar stars, those that never set symbols of eternal endurance. To be denied this cosmic path was to risk spiritual stagnation. A soul trapped outside its ordained cycle was a cosmic error, a living contradiction. Across Mesopotamia, similar warnings emerged. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the underworld was a place where dust was food and shadows remembered former lives only dimly. Improper burial condemned spirits to wander, weak and restless. Clay tablets spoke of necromancy not as fantasy, but as forbidden knowledge, capable of summoning the dead back into a half-existence. Again, the terror lay not in violence, but in loss of self. What connected these civilizations was not geography, but an understanding of death as a system regulated, sacred, and dangerous to disrupt. When the system failed, the result was not a demon, but a person hollowed of autonomy. In Haiti, this ancient fear took on new urgency under slavery. The plantation became a living tomb, the laborer already stripped of identity. The zombie was not a creature of night, but a reflection of daylight cruelty. Stories of the undead walking fields under command echoed the lived reality of forced labor. The myth survived because it spoke truth. Archaeological excavations in the Caribbean have uncovered burial practices designed to prevent zombification. Bodies buried face down, skulls removed, graves sealed with heavy stones. These measures were not acts of ignorance, but protective rituals rooted in centuries of inherited memory. Similar practices existed in ancient Europe and Asia, but as victims of imbalance. The modern image of the zombie mindless, aggressive, apocalyptic stands in stark contrast to its ancient ancestors. The original zombie was tragic, silent, and bound. It was not a threat to society. As the firelight of history flickers across continents and centuries, a single truth emerges. Humanity has always feared the theft of will more than death itself. Whether through poison, ritual, cosmic error, or cruelty, the idea of a body walking without a soul has haunted civilizations that understood how fragile identity truly is. And so the zombie, stripped of fiction and spectacle, reminding all who gaze upon it that the greatest horror is not rising from the grave, but never truly being alive at all. As centuries turned like slow-burning embers, the fear of enforced life after death traveled quietly across cultures, changing names but never substance. In the ancient Mediterranean world, philosophers and priests debated the nature of the soul with solemn urgency. To the Greeks, the psyche was breath and essence, released at death to descend into Hades. Yet even here, stories warned of souls denied rest. The dead who crossed the river Styx without proper rites became wandering shades, their memories blurred, their purpose erased. Homer's verses describe them as hollow echoes, capable of motion but stripped of strength, a poetic vision disturbingly close to later accounts of the walking dead. In Thessaly and other regions known for their esoteric practices, ancient writers recorded fears of necromancy. These were not tales of roaring monsters, but of bodies compelled through spells, herbs, and lunar rites. Astronomers of antiquity observed how certain constellations rose during burial seasons, linking celestial order to funerary law. When that order was violated, imbalance followed. Animation without harmony was considered a cosmic crime. Rome inherited these anxieties and codified them into law. The 12 Tables forbade magical interference with the dead, reflecting a widespread fear that corpses could be manipulated through illicit knowledge. Latin literature spoke of lemures and larvae, restless remnants of improperly appeased spirits. Households performed annual rites not out of superstition. The unquiet dead were not predators, they were wronged. Texts from the Zhou and Han dynasties described the Hun and Po dual souls that required balance. If disturbed, the body could reanimate as a jiangshi, a being animated without spiritual equilibrium. Burial practices reflected this fear. Graves were aligned with geomantic principles, coffins weighted, mirrors placed to repel disruptive forces. These global parallels reveal a profound truth. Humanity did not invent the zombie as entertainment. It arose from a shared dread that death could be mismanaged, that knowledge itself could become a tool of enslavement. Across continents, the walking body without will symbolized the ultimate violation of cosmic and moral law. In Haiti, these ancient patterns crystallized under uniquely brutal conditions. The island's sugar plantations operated with ruthless efficiency, fueled by forced labor and sustained suffering. Life expectancy for enslaved individuals was tragically short, and death was often the only imagined release. Within this reality, Vodou cosmology served as both spiritual refuge and social framework. It preserved African metaphysics while adapting to new horrors. Neither priest nor sorcerer in the simplistic sense, the Boker represented forbidden knowledge, the ability to manipulate forces meant to remain sacred. It was the gravest transgression, reserved for those believed to have violated communal law beyond forgiveness. Even then, it inspired dread rather than fascination. Accounts collected in the 19th century by colonial administrators, missionaries, and physicians often dismissed these beliefs as superstition. Yet these same records describe cases difficult to reconcile with dismissal alone. Individuals declared dead by authorities later reappeared, disoriented, silent, and altered. Medical understanding at the time lacked the language to explain catalepsy, neurotoxins, or hypoxic brain injury. What remained was the story. In the 20th century, scientific inquiry cautiously reopened these cases. Ethnobotanical studies identified compounds capable of inducing death-like states. Combined with tetrodotoxin, it created a pharmacological pathway from burial to broken consciousness. The result was not resurrection, but survival transformed into something unrecognizable. This explanation, however, did not erase the spiritual meaning. For communities that lived with ancestral memory, science merely described the mechanism of a terror already understood. The soul, once fractured, could not easily be restored. But domination of the inner self. Ancient texts echo this understanding with remarkable clarity. In Egyptian funerary inscriptions, the worst fate was not annihilation, but being devoured a second time, having the soul consumed after death, leaving only a husk. The Emmet, devourer of hearts, did not merely punish. It erased. Without a heart weighed true, the dead ceased to exist meaningfully. Animation without judgment was never a blessing. In Mesopotamian belief, ghosts of those denied burial wandered until appeased. Clay tablets from the city of Ur record rituals meant to restore rest to such spirits. These were not acts of fear-driven violence, but attempts at repair. Humanity's oldest civilizations sought to prevent the very condition later dramatized as horror. Even the Hebrew scriptures, approached with reverence, contain strict laws governing death, burial, and purity. The dead were to be honored, protected, and left undisturbed. Any manipulation of corpses was forbidden, reinforcing the idea that life and death belonged to divine order alone. These texts do not speculate about animation, but they condemn any attempt to control what lies beyond mortal authority. The convergence of these traditions suggests a deep-rooted ethical boundary recognized across cultures. To force continuation without consent was to shatter the universe's balance. The zombie, in its oldest form, was the embodiment of that transgression. As European colonial powers expanded, these ancient beliefs collided with Enlightenment rationalism. Scholars categorized, dismissed, and exoticized what they did not understand. Yet fear persisted, quietly migrating into literature. 19th-century novels explored themes of reanimation, mesmerism, and stolen will. Characters were hypnotized, drugged, and reduced to obedience, reflecting the same ancient anxiety under a scientific mask. The Haitian Revolution at the turn of the 19th century marked a turning point. Enslaved people rose, defeated empires, and reclaimed sovereignty. In the aftermath, the zombie myth shifted again. No longer only a symbol of punishment, it became a reminder of what had been escaped. To be free was to possess one's soul fully. To be enslaved was to risk losing it, even beyond death. Yet the world beyond Haiti misunderstood. American occupation in the early 20th century sensationalized Vodou, stripping it of context and dignity. What had once been a quiet warning became loud fantasy. Still, beneath layers of fiction, the ancient truth endured. Archaeology, anthropology, and comparative mythology reveal that the zombie is not an anomaly, but a convergence point. It stands where science meets ritual, where fear meets ethics, where power meets vulnerability. In every era, humanity has known that bodies can be broken, minds altered, and lives controlled. The zombie is the memory of that knowledge, preserved in story when language fails. It is not a creature of appetite, but of absence. Absence of will, absence of choice, absence of choice. As the embers of history glow brighter, the realization becomes unavoidable. The undead were never imagined as invaders from the grave. They were reflections of the living world's darkest capabilities. And in every civilization that feared them, there existed a shared hope that death, at least, would remain free. As the long arc of history bends toward the present age, the ancient fear of stolen will does not vanish. It simply changes its mask. Long after temples fell and empires turned to dust, the same unease surfaced wherever human beings confronted power without mercy. The zombie endured not because of fantasy, but because it carried memory of bodies used, minds subdued, and souls denied dignity. In the highlands of Africa, where many ancestral traditions carried to Haiti were born, oral history spoke of life force manipulation long before the Atlantic crossing. Among certain West African cosmologies, the soul was layered and fragile, capable of separation under extreme trauma. Enslavement itself was understood as a spiritual wound, capable of weakening the inner essence. When these beliefs crossed the ocean, they met new horrors and adapted, becoming sharper, more urgent, more severe. The zombie was not imported. It was refined by suffering. Geography itself played a role in shaping the myth. Haiti's limestone plateaus are riddled with caves and sinkholes, some used historically for burials. Tropical heat accelerates decomposition, complicating the signs of death. Shallow graves, common among impoverished populations, allowed for disturbance. The land, like the history lived upon it, blurred boundaries. In such an environment, certainty was rare, and fear found fertile ground. Anthropological studies conducted in the 20th century documented communities that spoke of zombification with solemn restraint. These accounts were not theatrical. They were quiet, heavy, and mournful. A zombified individual was not hunted or destroyed, but pitied. Such a fate was considered worse than death precisely because it denied rest. Even those believed responsible for creating zombies were feared, not admired. Power over the soul was power no human should possess. This moral clarity stands in stark contrast to later interpretations. As global media expanded, the zombie was transformed into spectacle, stripped of origin and meaning. The walking dead became symbols of apocalypse, contagion, and chaos. Yet these modern interpretations reveal more about contemporary anxieties than ancient ones. Fear shifted from enslavement to collapse, from domination to extinction. The creature remained, but the lesson changed. In psychological studies of extreme trauma, survivors often describe feeling detached from self, moving through life as observers rather than participants. Language struggles to describe this condition, reaching instead for metaphor, to be alive but absent, to function without agency. The ancient image of the walking body without soul returns, not as myth, but as human experience. Neuroscience further illuminates this boundary. Damage to specific brain regions can erase personality while preserving motor function. Memory, empathy, and identity can be stripped away, leaving behind a human form that moves and responds, yet feels hollow. Science does not trivialize the myth. It confirms its plausibility. The terror was never impossible. It was always nearby. Ancient astronomers may have understood this symbolically. Across cultures, the stars were seen as guardians of order. The circumpolar constellations, ever present in the night sky, symbolized permanence and coherence. To fall out of alignment was to lose one's place in the cosmos. The zombie, in this sense, was a being out of orbit still present, but no longer part of the greater harmony. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this interpretation. Burial sites across continents reveal consistent concern for containment and protection. Stones placed upon bodies, limbs bound, graves sealed with ritual precision. These practices were not born of panic, but of respect for balance. Death required care. Disturbance invited consequences. In medieval Europe, revenant legends echoed the same dread. Corpses were said to rise not to feast, but to wander, spreading misfortune simply by existing. Communities responded not with terror alone, but with ritual correction prayers, reburials, and sanctification. The goal was restoration, not destruction. Once again, the emphasis lay on peace. The Haitian zombie belongs firmly within this ancient lineage. It is not an anomaly of belief, but a convergence point where history, biology, spirituality, and ethics meet. It reflects a world where the greatest injustice was not mortality, but ownership of another's existence. Even after emancipation, the memory endured. To this day, Haitian law explicitly criminalizes zombification, recognizing it as a form of severe abuse. This is not symbolic legislation. It acknowledges historical trauma and affirms the sanctity of personhood. Few myths have ever been treated with such legal seriousness. The endurance of the zombie across 3,000 years reveals something essential about humanity. Civilizations rise and fall, languages fade. And gods change names, yet certain fears remain constant. The loss of autonomy, the erasure of self, and the violation of death itself haunt the collective mind. Stories preserve what law and science cannot always prevent. As the firelight of memory flickers lower, the ancient storyteller's lesson becomes clear. The zombie was never meant to terrify through violence. It was meant to warn through sorrow. It stands as a reminder that life is more than breath and motion. It is will, memory, and the right to choose one's own path, even into death. When these elements are stolen, what remains is not a monster, but a tragedy. The walking dead are not invaders from beyond the grave. They are echoes of what happens when power forgets compassion, when systems value labor over life, and when the soul is treated as expendable. In the end, the zombie's oldest truth is not about resurrection, but about restraint. It asks whether humanity will honor the invisible boundaries that protect dignity. It asks whether knowledge will serve balance or domination. And it reminds every generation that the greatest horror is not dying, but being denied the peace that death promises. The ancient voices fall silent now, their warnings spoken. The embers fade, but the lesson remains, carried forward through story rather than fear, through memory rather than myth. If these ancient voices touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Ancient Epics and ringing the bell so you never miss the next forgotten tale. Thanks for watching.